I think you look around the world and you see these things being done much more quickly than we do them in London. So you sort of say, is that a problem? I mean, in a way, it's a problem, you could say. But I actually think that, when you're designing these sorts of master plans, that you're sort of tracing the history of a city in microcosm, if you see what I mean. So in a way, to spend a few years doing it is probably absolutely appropriate. You are discovering the place, you're discovering the communities that live around it, you're discovering the logic of, the certain mixes of uses, you're discovering the logic of different patterns of movement. These things take time. And so I think that they are necessarily projects which evolve over many years. Because of that, though, it puts certain pressures on the process and on the plan. I mean, I should say, when we talk about master plans, we say a master plan is a process, not a plan. I mean, you are really designing a process. So there are drawings in 2 dimensions, but really you're setting out a way to let something be carried out, a kind of game which can, be played over many years.
Hello, welcome to Talking Place, the podcast bringing placemakers and storytellers together to talk about place. I'm your host, Tanisha Raffiuddin. I am the founder of Concept Culture, a creative agency in London, passionate about creating purposeful brands and telling powerful stories. In this episode, it is my absolute pleasure to talk place with Bob Allies. Bob Allies is a partner of Allies and Morrison. He is also the architect in residence for the city of Bath and professor of architecture at the University of Bath, alongside holding a number of other influential chair and trustee positions. Allies and Morrison's work encompasses architecture, urbanism, and planning. They have been instrumental in master planning many of London's major regeneration projects, from King's Cross to the Olympic legacy. In this episode, Bob shares his philosophy on urban design, the power of continuity, and why cities must embrace change to survive. We dive into the art of master planning as a process, the tension between flexibility and fixity, viability of long-term urban projects, and public space stewardship. Bob also reflects on his role as Bath's first ever architect in residence and the Practice's 2025 Stirling Prize nomination for the London College of Fashion. It's a rich, thoughtful conversation with one of the leading thinkers of urban design today about how places and cities evolve and how we shape them. So please do stick around till the end. All right, let's talk place. Bob, welcome to the Talking Place podcast.
Thank you.
And thank you for hosting us here at the Allies and Morrison headquarters here in Bankside.
Pleasure.
Bob, you've shaped some of the major and most transformative urban spaces here in London, from King's Cross to the Olympic Park. Can you share a little bit about your journey into architecture and urban design and what continues to drive your work today?
When we began the practice, Graham Morrison and I, it started because we were working together, and we were working together on housing projects in Milton Keynes, actually. And there's no question, but at that time we were very interested in how the buildings, the housing is being used to make external space. We were working for a guy called Martin Richardson, and that was definitely the forefront of his thinking. So I think that is a starting point, that we became interested in that aspect of architecture, as much as buildings are interested in the spaces between them. We then sort of went our separate ways for a couple of years, but I went to Rome, to the British School at Rome as a Rome scholar. And I think that only kind of reinforced my interest in urbanism. And I look particularly actually at the way in the late Renaissance that architects were very prepared to distort the plans of their buildings and didn't need them to be ideal plans. They were more interested in how they would adjust and respond to the urban condition that they found themselves. So again, for me, that was a kind of inspiration, I guess. And then, the other thing, which I suppose was a direct provocation in terms of King's Cross and our involvement in this way, was in the late 90s, we were appointed to work on the project in Brindleyplace in Birmingham, which was Argent's first real project. And we were invited to two of the buildings. But during that period, working with them, that was really when this conversation began about urban design. Argent were very committed then to the idea that they were going to make a piece of city. It wasn't going to be an office park or anything like that. It was a piece of city. And so the sort of discussions that went on about how to do that, what that meant, began then. And I think obviously that, then were important for the evolution of King's Cross when that started a few years later.
Amazing. And because this podcast is called Talking Place, I like to start with understanding what place means to you.
Well, it's such a complicated thing, isn't it? Place. And often you think about that, the way Terry Farrell set it out, these various 5 components. Yeah. And whenever I'm trying to remember which is which, what is PLACE and what they refer to, I find now I think of, was it community or, was it energy? Was it, and you realize that the acronym, in other words, is still inadequate to encompass all the things that have to be dealt with. And of course, they are all important. But I'd say that from our practice's point of view, there are a number of things which we identify as being important in the projects we carry out. So first one probably is the notion of continuity with the history of the site. I mean, we are very interested in how our projects grow out of some unique character of the site that you're working within. In fact, I mean, in a sense, it's the only way really to create unique places in the future, if you can build on that. No point in just bringing your formulas to bear to these things. But also continuity very much in terms of the areas which surround the site. So, a lot of emphasis on thinking about how we connect into to everything else. A second one I think is probably, and it's an odd word to use these days, but is hierarchy. In other words, we definitely believe that understanding the hierarchy of a town or a city or any kind of settlement is an essential prerequisite to working within it. And when you prepare a master plan, or indeed when you design a building, that you should be cognizant of the way your project works within that hierarchy. And that's important because it's through these hierarchies that people understand their cities. It's through these hierarchies that people can find their way around and so on. So it's not a kind of top-down assertion. It's a kind of bottom-up requirement that people need to understand their places in this way. And so we think that's a very important aspect of these sorts of projects. And then the third one, and I suppose it's in some ways it's so obvious, and yet I really think it doesn't always get discussed enough, is simply the question of enclosure, of how buildings frame space. There's a tendency to think of qualities in the kind of abstract, but actually we in the practice are really much more focused on the physical, on the real physical consequences of what you place where and how buildings enclose external space. And, every building, I mean, I think you can say every building always has this double job. A building is a way of accommodating a whole series of functions, and it begins from that position, and it begins with, how you organize space and internally, and how you construct the building around that. But buildings always also have a job of making external space. Their facades are about how you enclose other spaces. And I think that's something which in our master plans we really tend to prioritize. We think that's an essential part of the project. And so in terms of the way we organize them in plan terms, but also the way we codify them, that's where our interest lies.
Amazing. And I really like that you talk about continuity, because I think cities will live on beyond our lifetime, and then there'll be a next generation.
Absolutely.
Of people who will enjoy it. And, cities like, London, they're so old, there's so much history, so layered, and every generation will probably enjoy it differently.
Well, I mean, there are two extraordinary qualities the cities have, and one of them is that ability to keep changing and evolving. And I mean, put simply, if they don't, they'll probably die. It's very difficult. And you obviously have some cities which are so unique, like Venice and maybe like Bath, but where in a way you have to look after the history very strictly. Yeah. And maybe that they're so significant that they have a chance of survival. But generally cities they just have to grow and change. And it is that, and what's very exciting about them is that is when you see that dynamic of change. And I think London has been remarkable in that way, over a sort of, it's probably really since the 60s, really, how it's had a kind of motor of change. And people worry about it and people talk about, gentrification and all those things. But nevertheless, what's happened is just this phenomenon where change and evolution just kind of keeps kind of moving around the city, going to different places and going, outwards and so on. And I think that's much more important than trying to fix a city in time. And then the other thing about cities is that they are an extraordinary example of something which is achieved by multiple different people and agencies and institutions together, so it's absolutely the way they evolved embodies the principle really of kind of working together. And, and even the kind of simplest of idea, like the party wall, for example, between buildings. Yeah. What a brilliant invention, that allows two buildings to be placed side by side. And in a way that it allows them both to be, to relate to each other directly, absolutely directly, and yet also allows them to be different. I mean, it's a brilliant invention. And that's, the city relies on that sort of sharing of things all the time. And we share everything in cities, don't we? That's why they're so efficient, really, because we're sharing, we're sharing the roads, that we walk, we get around on them. They have our utilities in them, it's a fantastic way of sharing everything together. And that's why, that's one of the reasons they're interesting. I think in terms of sustainability, that's one of the reasons why they're so powerful now.
Yeah. No, absolutely. The only constant is change. I grew up in Asia. I grew up in Hong Kong and Mumbai. Then I moved to London, and I go back to Mumbai once a year. And every time I go back, it has changed phenomenally. Like the rate of development that's happening in India as a country, the rate at which the infrastructure is coming up. I grew up in a time where most buildings were 4-story. Now they're 20-story, 40-story. All those 4-story buildings are undergoing redevelopment. They were built, 60, 70 years ago. And everything is now minimum 4 stories, 40 stories. Okay. So that change, and I've experienced it, seeing it, and the rapidity at which that change is happening. But I wonder, I just wanted to, you touched upon this, people are concerned about change. Is there something discomforting when a city changed that rapidly? It's like, you've had your specific haunts and your specific spaces, and they disappear for something which is supposed to be better. But is there then a sense of loss when the city evolves that quickly?
I think people are very naturally protective of the environment which they live in and they like, and I think it's absolutely reasonable that people, resist change or find change hard to take. So I don't dismiss that. I completely get that feeling, and also I think that it's important that change is carried out in the context of things which are retained. I mean, it is those judgments about how to look after what you have at the same time as introducing change that's important, and it's very hard. It's not. There's much discussion at the moment about whether you through design codes you can get the outcomes you want, but design codes necessarily simply look at existing conditions and argue and say do the same thing again. But the hardest parts of cities, for towns, actually in villages everywhere really, is the moment at which are the edges of certain conditions. When you move from high density to medium density or medium density to low density. Or, where you have direct relationships between a new building and an existing building, or even just the moment in time where there are pressures to change. And that's the hardest aspect of urbanism, is negotiating your way through these sort of transitional aspects of the city between one thing and another, one moment and another. And we in the practice, I think we we are involved in projects, and some projects are involved with large buildings, but it is that finding a way through those relationships which definitely is really important to us, because it's not enough simply, put simply, it's not enough just to add something new. You have to find this connection with what exists.
Yeah. So Bob, tell me, do you have a favorite place?
I don't think
it doesn't have to be something you designed.
No, exactly. No, I don't know whether I have a favorite place, but I mean, I do think there are two places where I lived, which I really appreciate. One of those I've already mentioned, which is Rome. I mean, I do find Rome a really compelling city. Now, I mean, it's in so many ways, it's, remarkable and beautiful and so on. I mean, equally, of course, in so many ways, it's difficult and problematic. And, there are huge urban issues that surround Rome as well. But as a kind of reminder, really, of how cities can evolve, and, I mean, touches on what we've already been talking about how cities can evolve and they can somehow build upon their history and they can keep changing, but the history is still there. This idea of the palimpsest, of this kind of trace of what was there before all the time. I think all cities should have that, really. I think we should all try and achieve that, have that sense of retaining our history within our new development. But of course, the other thing which it does is it reminds you that, again, we've already talked about it, but it reminds you of the importance of change. Rome isn't static. It has evolved and changed. And you also get that from the city. You get that sense of, interesting how it is, this has changed, that's evolved. And each of those moves are very interesting. So I think it gives you a kind of a positivity about change, as well as a kind of respect for what was there before. Yeah. Rome has been very important to me. And the second city, Edinburgh, is the other one I would probably mention. I mean, that's where I trained to be an architect. Okay. So I spent 5 years in Edinburgh. Of course, it's so tangible in Edinburgh, in a way, in a sense that you have this extraordinary medieval city really built on this ridge, and then you have the valley, and then you have the new town being built in the 18th century. And so you really see how cities evolve, and the sorts of and the role of the planner. They evolve as somebody kind of engaging with the organisation of buildings and the organisation of spaces when James Craig set out the plan for the new town. Particularly interesting because almost the topography almost replicated the topography of the old town, if you know, the same development on a ridge and so on. And then, of course, Edinburgh continued to grow. And again, it's fascinating how the architecture, the urban form is so subtle and ingenious in the way that it responds to the topography of the city. So you have a architectural language, an urban language evolving, but it's all predicated on this complex landscape which they've been given to work with. And I think, again, that idea that specificity, as it were, of the plan and the architecture growing out of the place is something which I love about Edinburgh. I mean, it's for a student, it's a fantastic place to live in as well, because everything is so compressed and focused on the centre of the city. And of course I think one thing we've learned in the last 20 years really is that density, which used to be kind of frowned upon really in planning terms. It was a bad term. Density was always a negative. Now we've realized that density is absolutely a positive and is key to sustainability. So
I was actually going to ask you whether you thought density was a dirty word, but you've already answered that. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, Rome, Edinburgh, both romantic, very romantic places. I got engaged in Rome, so it holds a very special memory for me. And I remember having this really long list of things to see in Rome, but only 5 days, and I just couldn't get
overwhelming.
It was overwhelming. It defeated me. Now, I had a checklist. As a young architect, Rome is the Mecca of everything. But I remember speaking to an architect who was based in Rome, and he's like, it's like the worst place to be an architect because you can't design anything new.
No. Well, that's true. And I mean, Edinburgh would probably have said the same things at different times. But it is difficult. It does make it harder.
But I guess Edinburgh, well, thanks to Harry Potter is inviting the next generation to come and appreciate it. I recently visited and they do these Harry Potter trails and little children, dressed in their Hogwarts uniforms, and engaging with the city in a different way. So I find that really nice for Edinburgh, that it's welcoming people from around the world going to this great piece of literature that everyone romanticizes, that it's the birthplace of the Harry Potter franchise. But anyway, now into the heart of your work. So like I said before we started the interview, that I listened to one of your videos with Peter Murray from 2020, and he asked you, to quantify the amount of space that the practice had masterplanned in London. And at the time you had responded it was 500 hectares. That was 5 years ago, so that number probably increased. And then 50,000 homes. An area, for those who can't visualize it, an area the size of West End. But obviously that has since grown. But I guess, I know we only have an hour, but in a concise way, what are some of the common themes or lessons you have learned from these very long-term projects, 20, 25 years in the making? Can you maybe crystallize that learning?
Well, it is true that these are projects which take a long time to carry out. King's Cross, well, we began in 2000, and you might say in 2025 it is almost complete.
Yeah.
I mean, not quite. Maybe next year is when it'll be complete. So it's a kind of 25-year cycle.
Yeah.
And probably a third of that time was spent in getting the project up and running. I mean, getting the planning approval and so on. 2/3 in carrying it out. But other projects that we've been involved with, like Brent Cross Town, I actually began working on in 1999. And the first buildings are going to be occupied this year.
Oh,
so that's another.
That was even before.
That was even before King Cross. So that's another, and that will be another 15 or 20 years probably until it's finished. Projects like Royal Arsenal Woolwich, we probably began in the 2008. But also all of these master plans, they take a long time to happen. They take quite a long time to go through the planning process. And I think you look around the world and you see these things being done much more quickly than we do them in London. So you sort of say, is that a problem? I mean, in a way, it's a problem, you could say. But I actually think that when you're designing these sorts of master plans, that you're sort of tracing the history of a city in microcosm, if you see what I mean. So in a way, to spend a few years doing it is probably absolutely appropriate. You are discovering the place, you're discovering the communities that live around it, you're discovering the logic of, the certain mixes of uses, you're discovering the logic of different patterns of movement. These things take time. And so I think that they are necessarily projects which evolve over many years. Because of that, though, it puts certain pressures on the process and on the plan. I mean, I should say, when we talk about master plans, we say a master plan is a process, not a plan. I mean, it is you are really designing a process. So there are drawings in 2 dimensions, but really you're setting out a way to let something be carried out, a sort of a kind of game which can, be played over many years. And I suppose the thing we've learned on these master plans, we've learned various things. I mean, one thing we've learned is that you can't require excessive investments in infrastructure at the beginning of the project. So you have to kind of be able to make headway with the project without having to spend huge amounts of money before you can start. Otherwise, it's very difficult to make them go ahead. And the main aim of a master plan is to help people take the decisions to go ahead. But more fundamentally, perhaps, is that over the course of these projects, you're in this interesting sort of paradox where when you're talking to the local community or talking to the planners, in some way, even talking to the developer or to the client, you're looking for some level of fixity. You're looking for something which everybody can buy into and understand. and give everybody confidence that if that thing that you've described, we talk about an illustrative master plan, if that thing you've described and drawn is achieved, everybody says, yeah, okay, that's fine. That's the kind of, that outcome would be acceptable. So you need fixity in that way for everybody. And yet, of course, you also need flexibility, because if it's carried out over many years, at King's Cross, of course, there was the 2008 crash, which landed right at the start of the project. Because you're delivering it over time, it's happening over time, there are all sorts of changes that go on in that time period. Economic pressures change, the market changes, the building typologies change, assumptions about plans of buildings. I mean, we've seen huge changes, obviously, particularly in residential design because of Grenfell in the last few years. All of these things are overlaid on it. So if your plan is so prescriptive that it can't adjust to these different situations as they emerge, then that is a real problem, and that will slow things down. And in King's Cross, we working with the local authority, with Camden, with Peter Bishop, and within Argent work with their head of planning, Robert Evans. Together we developed a way of documenting King's Cross that recognised the importance of this. I mean, just to give a couple of examples. I think King's Cross is one of the first projects in this country where we didn't apply for fixed quantums of different uses, but for minimum and maximum quantums of different uses. So actually the project could change over time. And we also identified we call them swing blocks, building plots where we all agreed that in the end it could be housing, it could be office, it could be hotel, and that again could change over time. So we were trying to find a way through this dilemma. And so that's not this is in a sense not about the outcome, but it's absolutely about the role of the master planner, the task of the master planner, and how they have to think, I think, through this process. I mean, King's Cross doesn't have, it has parameter plans and it has a kind of coding. But what it codifies are external spaces, actually, is what it codifies. So it defines through the site a series of external spaces, and it sets out the obligations of the architects in terms of how they relate to those spaces. But we don't codify materials, we don't codify, window proportions, we don't codify horizontal datums. There are so many things. So in some ways, it's much more open.
Yeah.
But we do codify daylight, fun enough. So as you build a building at King's Cross, whatever height you build to, it will define, it will have a kind of ricochet effect, a ripple effect on the adjacent plot, and define how that building the height of that building and its setbacks. So, we like to talk about it as a kind of dynamic master plan, because it's not achieving a precise outcome that we determine on day one. It is setting something in motion in which people have to deal with as it goes forward.
Yeah, because the world has probably changed so much in this 25-year time span. And, you touched upon the financial crash, then Grenfell, COVID, so many things have happened. And what always fascinates me is, let's go back in time to that moment, maybe in 2000 when you were drawing this plan. And do you feel like it's a weight of responsibility when you're, mapping out this city and what it's going to look like? Like, you're almost like future gazing? You're like, is looking into a crystal ball and visualizing what the world would be in 2025. I find that so fascinating. There wasn't a question. There was more of observation. Like, it was a weight of responsibility, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I think the thing is, though, that you can't, in the end, you can't imagine what the world's going to be like.
Yeah.
So the best you can do, in a way, is, I think probably, this is fair to say, the best you can do is design something which people will want to carry out now. And we all know that making things happen is as important as anything else. That's a challenge for us all. So in a way, you tend to work with what you think you can do now, but you just have to be alert to the fact that things will change. I mean, for example, another example might be, there's a tendency in master plans when doing master planning to say, well, when you lay out the spaces and particularly the patterns of movement, that you say this is a road, this is a pedestrian route, this is a something else, and you designate all of those characteristics on day one. We resist that in our master plans. So we tend to talk about where people move, and we then say that those spaces can be managed in different ways over time. So it might be a road in the end, but it might become pedestrianised. But we're not going to treat it as one thing or another. We're going to try and leave that more open. And the King's Cross, the boulevard, for example, of King's Cross was originally, was designed with the ability to take a new tram route through the middle of it. Well, the tram route didn't happen in the end for all sorts of other reasons.
There's definitely no tram.
But equally, there are roads in King's Cross which we built as roads, and they're now being taken out as roads and turned into pedestrian routes. And I think that's exactly the right answer. I think that you're making a kind of matrix, kind of urban matrix, and that should have it should have a level of flexibility in the way it's used, because people will keep wanting to manage the city in different ways. That will go on always.
Yeah. So just talking about movement, I know I mentioned this to you earlier, the Olympic Park, also one of the projects that you worked on. The park now, because it's this wonderful pedestrian, no car zone, has become the hub for the Pokemon Go community. And because it's this fantastic place where, the community sends on these events in their hundreds, and all people playing on their phone, but they're playing in a place that you have obviously master planner designed, but that place is replicated in the game. Because there are no cars, people can move freely and play the game and get the rewards and, find joy in the game. That's probably not something we were planning for, but maybe the master planners of the future have to think about designing places where virtual gamers can go and happen. Yeah, gaming is huge. We all know this. $1 billion industry. But I just wanted to share that anecdote of how that space has given this community this beautiful place to play.
Right. Well, I mean,
play this game. Yeah.
It is fascinating. And of course, although we had no idea that would happen, and no idea that it did happen actually either. But what is true is that with these, again, it sort of relates back to the previous question. When the park was being thought about right from the beginning of the project, there were big debates really. Was it who was the park for? What was it for? I must say we were always in the camp that it was for the local communities, and in a way we designed the master plan was designed in such a way that it tried not to see it as the Olympic Park and housing in the Olympic Park. It tried to see as each of the adjacent communities, pulling in to meet the Olympic Park, each one kind of joining up to meet it. And so one of the, what interested us most was the idea to the extent to which the park would be taken over by the local communities. But there was a debate about should it be a kind of global destination? Is that what it should be? Mm-hmm. And, should what went into it be to do with inviting people from across the world? Well, a little bit of that will happen, with Sadler's Wells, Sadler's Wells, but also the V&A particularly maybe. And, it will be somewhere which people will want to come to from around the world. But I think its value maybe the Pokemon is the capital as well. People coming from much wider to come to see it. So it is, maybe in the end, the truth is that these places have to work on every level, and you just have to make sure you're trying to make them accessible to everybody. Yeah, is the key.
Yeah, I think it's just the reason why I want to share that anecdote is that that's what an outcome that happened. You probably didn't plan for, but a particular community thought, oh, this is cool. This works for us. Yeah. Let's come and descend on it. At that same weekend of the Go Fest, it was a sunny day, full of families. The park is full of families, and especially Asian families love to congregate in their numbers, and they'll bring all their food, and they'll just make a day of it. And so it's multiple communities, typologies of people were enjoying the same space, and I thought that was just amazing. As an urban lover, as a city lover, we talk about inclusive design. Always this place, does someone feel welcome? this is new and shiny. But I don't know. The Olympic Park for me, and just following what you were saying, I think it works both at this place where communities feel welcome and use it. People who live in East Village, for example, and in Stratford and beyond, but also as a global destination. Now, thanks to this new shiny East Bank Cultural Quarter and the stadium attracts
that's really cool.
the crowd. I recently went to see Iron Maiden, and I'm sure there were fans from all over the world who came to see their 50th year concert. So it has achieved both.
Yeah.
Just again, anecdotally as a visitor. So yeah, I think places can accommodate multiple communities. A community will find a way to own and take up space in that community. So, all right, I'm just back from the London Real Estate Forum, so that kind of a place where everyone talks about viability. So let's talk about viability. Senior developers, planners, communities all have different aspirations for a place. But at the end of the day, the numbers have to stack up, the fundamentals have to stack up for development to go ahead. So in your experience now, having seen a couple of places grow over time, over a 20-25 year period of time, what are the key drivers or levers that can make a large master plan financially viable?
Well, viability is always a problem on every project. So even projects that go ahead, they're still going ahead sort of with being challenged by their viability. And of course, all the time we're always having to confront on all our projects, but particularly housing, trying all the time to make them feasible and trying to ensure that they are. I mean, I suppose what I feel at the moment is that it seems to become particularly challenging. And I have a kind of worry about a phenomenon which has grown, I think, over the course of 20 years or so, which is that we have burdened housing we charged it with achieving a huge amount of different things. So in a way, it begins with, percentage of affordable housing. I mean, I have to say, I think the fact that happened is absolutely incredible. I think it's transformed all our projects, and certainly for us, transformed our experience of them, knowing that they're always built for different tenures, and you have a mix of people living there. It's been absolutely wonderful. But it is a cost burden which falls on the private sector. Although, I think people think, oh, well, that's a fine because it's just being taken out of the developer's profit. I don't think that's really true. I think it's being put on top of the price of the new homes. So it's really making housing more expensive is all it's doing. The environmental standards we apply now, again, I mean, how, completely worthy, but it's getting more expensive, much more expensive to build homes at the moment. Biodiversity net gain, unarguably a good thing, but another cost that it's having to bear. The amount of public open space that we provide in projects has increased or become more and more important. Again, absolutely right, but the cost of maintaining it falls on the service charges of the residents. It's an extra cost that they have to bear in the future because the costs are not being borne by the local authorities. So housing, whether you're renting or whether you're buying, the prices have just gone higher and higher because of what we expected to achieve, not to mention, Section 106 and SIL. I mean, so many things that are creamed off housing. And it's very hard to question this because all of them are positive things that people are trying to achieve. They're all gains. But I do think it's put housing under pressure even before you put it in the particular kind of financial context of the interest rates and so on, which is obviously the fundamental thing at the moment. So I think at the moment, in a way, when I look at housing, I mean, not particularly from within the practice, but from my role in Bath, which you might talk about at some point, I'm sort of trying to argue now for housing to be as simple as we can make it, in a way.
Amen.
And I think that's a kind of architectural challenge as well as a political challenge or a planning challenge. And I think that's where architects probably have to think hard about what they're doing. And, it makes sense in terms of carbon and everything, I think probably as well. But I think that's probably, I think that will change a bit the way we think about things in the future.
So make housing simple. And then let's talk about stewardship as well. These are long-term places and they're going to exist in the future, and you've touched upon this already. But what's your take on the privatization of public spaces?
Well, it obviously became a kind of big issue, and maybe still is for some people a big issue. And it's certainly something which is discussed around King's Cross, is what does that mean? And you do go there and you see people going around with red caps on and keeping an eye on things. The truth is at King's Cross that giving the local authority, Camden, would never have wanted to take over all the public space at King's Cross. They could never have wanted to have to cover the cost of maintaining it. So really, and that's, very often the case on these projects, that the council doesn't want to do that. So it's not always the developer wanting to hang on to things and keep it private. It's very often the council not wanting to take responsibility as well. The other thing is that it's not actually the privatization of public space. It's private space being put into the public domain. It's what normally happens is it's that way around. It's space which was private, now being opened up to the public use. And I think that's important to bear that in mind. King's Cross there's a very strong obligation at King's Cross to maintain the spaces in terms of public access. And I think that's really what you want to see happen. And I also think at King's Cross, you get people enjoying the space in a way, it feels safe to be there. It feels comfortable to be there. They are very open public spaces. These are not exclusive in any way. They're absolutely inclusive. And when you look at the people who are using those spaces, it is absolutely drawing people in, from local people, but from really all sort of sectors of the cities. And I think in the end, I don't know where the argument takes us, really. I think that in an ideal world, maybe one day, if we pay enough in tax, then our cities and our governments can take over and look after all our public space. Yeah. Until we pay the tax to do it, which I'd welcome, actually. But until we do, then I think it's difficult.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair point. And you hear this all the time at urban design conferences and all these spaces. And personally, I think the safety element is very important. As a woman, my parameters for feeling safe are probably different. And I don't know, somehow seeing people in security, for me, makes me feel safer.
Yeah.
So that's, most people will be like, oh, there's security guards. I don't know. For me, personally, that makes me feel safer. We're still London, still central London.
Yeah.
We're not the safest city in the world. We can't kid ourselves. So I think the safety element, and if there's, paid security, someone is paying for that security to make that place feel safer, I'm all for it.